encouraged. We hope you'll hear some information which maybe some will be new to you, some of you may have heard before, but overall we're hoping to share a pitch with you tonight of some really good news that's happening across cystic fibrosis research, both in the UK and around the world this evening. We're well aware that that doesn't always replicate in how people's individual circumstances are working at the moment. And so we're planning to make this evening quite interactive as well, so if you've got questions you'd like to ask as we're going along, please do just feel free to stop me, etc. What I'm going to be talking about is what is happening inside cystic fibrosis research in the UK and around the world, what the Trust is up to at the moment, and what some new things you might expect to see coming through the therapeutic pipeline inside cystic fibrosis. As Donna said, you've actually got two for the price of one tonight as well, because some of you may know I'm actually leaving the Trust at the end of this week, sadly. But my successor, Ed Owen, delighted he's able to be here. So I welcome Ed, have you with us. And Ed's going to say a few words to introduce himself as well and talk about some of what he might be thinking about over these coming few months as well. Hi. Now these are exciting times inside cystic fibrosis at the moment. You'll be aware that when the Cystic Fibrosis Trust started back in 1964, the life expectancy was low. In fact, we often say that when the Trust started, the survivors went to school. And still in many parts of Eastern Europe, that's still the situation today. But over the last 50 years, enormous advances have been made in the care of people living with CF in the UK, which has had quite a dramatic impact. In fact, the data we have from our patient registry now shows that predicted life expectancy in the UK is now the highest in the world. It's a statistical figure, so it doesn't mean very much at all, and I'll talk a bit more about it later. But the number 41 is now the highest predicted life expectancy anywhere in the world at the moment. And that hasn't happened by accident. It's happened because the UK is served by a uniquely skilled and dedicated set of CF physicians and consultants and dietitians and physiotherapists and social workers and others who make up that multidisciplinary team who have over the years worked hard and hard and hard to increase life expectancy in the UK. I think what we're very aware of in the UK at the CF Trust is that there can't be we cannot accept a glass ceiling inside CF. We must keep pushing the research further forward to find ways in which we can make CF a condition that can be more normally lived with over a normal lifespan. A few months ago, I went down to meet with Archie Norman. Not Archie Norman, our trustee, but actually his father, Archie Norman Sr., who is now about 98, still very sharp mind, sits there reading his BMJs every day. And Archie Norman Sr. Founded the CF service at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And he retired 30 years ago. And when he retired, average life expectancy was 16. And it moved from 6 to 16 during his lifetime. And he had two tools in his toolkit, the two Ps as he referred to them as: physiotherapy and penicillin, and that was it. So by his applied effort of his personal skill and everything else, he managed to increase life expectancy over that period of time. And when he retired, he thought, 16, we've achieved it, that's as far as we're going to get in cystic fibrosis. He's now amazed to hear that life expectancy is now with the 40s, and for many children born today, is into the 50s as well. And part of what that tells us, I think, is there is not a glass ceiling inside CF. We must keep pushing the research forward, improving clinical care to make sure that everyone has got the fullest chance possible for a full life. So what I want to do tonight is talk about what some of those new advances are, some of the things that are being done at the moment and are going to be happening over the next few years to make sure that we can continue to push that glass ceiling further forward. Now, you'll know that the CF Trust, over the last 50 years, has focused on three areas. Yes, the Trust has worked hard to try and support families living with cystic fibrosis. Yes, the Trust has found a way in which it can deliver detailed and expert clinical care in the United Kingdom, and now amongst the best clinical care available anywhere in the world. But the beating heart of the thing, ever since the Trust started, in fact the Trust used to be called the CF Research Trust, the beating heart of the CF Trust since it started has been about research. Clinical research, basic science research, research into understanding and ultimately combating cystic fibrosis. So part of what you're going to be hearing tonight is an update on where some of that research lies at the moment, and there's some really good news about that. Some of the news actually is fresh off the press yesterday, and we're going to be pointing out some areas where further research needs to be done as well, and some of the things which the Trust will be wanting to prioritise and focus its efforts on over the coming few years. So what we've been doing over the last 18 months or so, and thank you for those of you who have been involved in helping us with this, is doing quite an extensive piece of research to map out, well, where is CF research at the moment, not just in the UK, but all around the world. Where are the gaps? What more needs to be done? And what are the things which the Trust can really focus and prioritise our minds on? And that's why we've produced a new strategic document, Living Longer, Living Better. We haven't got a copy for you each tonight, it's available on the website if you'd like to have a look at it. And what I'm going to do tonight is, rather than take you through it page by page, I'm going to talk about some of the key themes in it, which we think are really, really important for the future of CF care and research in the UK today. We've grouped our work into 4 main headings. Don't worry so much about the headings, but it's an easy way for people like me to be able to remember what it is we're about. Not surprisingly, I'm going to talk a bit more about this in a moment, finding ways in which we can continue to push life expectancy longer out into the future. Really, really important. Secondly, to try and make sure that the quality of that life is at the very highest level. I'll explain a bit more about that in just a moment. Thirdly, we know that the reason why there are 50 expert CF centres in the UK just now isn't, again, by accident. It's because people like the CF Trust have worked hard over the last 50 years to make sure there are 50 leading CF services in the UK. And now we need to redouble our efforts to make sure that CF care going forward into the future is as good, if not even better. And again, I'll talk a bit more about some of the details about that. And one of the other things, I'm sure I'm not the only person in the room, but when I say I work in cystic fibrosis, people say to me, I used to have that. And showing a great misunderstanding about what cystic fibrosis actually is. So I think the final bit, which we've heard very clearly from the CF community, we've got to really, really get right, is making sure we're telling the stories about cystic fibrosis, communicating very well within our community, but also communicating more widely as well. Please feel called shouting louder. So let me talk to you about some of the areas which we think are really, really important to have a look at in increasing life expectancy. And I'll come back to talk about some of the more details about bits of work actually in the system in just a moment. What we've been trying to do is to map out 2 different concepts. One is the CF disease cycle. That is the life cycle of how CF actually works. What does it mean for us, for people with CF, to get mucus building up in the lung? Focus on the lung for a moment. For that lung then to become infected, that infection then to cause inflammation, that inflammation then to cause scarring, and for that scarring then to cause permanent lung damage. And a lot of the work that's gone on over the last 50 years has been to try and find ways in which that cycle can get broken, either by clearing the mucus more quickly, stopping the infection happening for antibiotics, etc., stopping inflammation or stopping scarring. Now I'm going to talk a bit more about some new areas that need to be looked at in that. And as you all know, one of the key things that's being worked on right here in the UK at the moment is gene therapy, to try and find a way in which we can actually stop that whole process starting in the first place by dealing with the genetic defect at its source. And I'll give you an update on where some of that work is in just a moment. We know that despite all the work that's gone on over the last 50 years, that sadly people with CF are still getting far too many lung infections, and a lot more work is needed to look into antibiotics and other ways of understanding the microbiology of what actually happens inside the CF lung. There's some really interesting research coming through about that just at the moment, which might actually mean us giving less antibiotics to some patients in future rather than more, in order to try and keep the equilibrium of bacteria in the lung and deal with Pseudomonas through different avenues. But I'll say a bit more about that if you'd like me to in a minute. We've recognised also, as well as looking at the disease life cycle, we're trying to look at the human life cycle. So what happens when a child is born and is diagnosed with newborn screening, which you know the CF Trust campaign for over the last 5 or 6 years. So what happens to children as they become primary school age children, then become young teenagers, enter in transition, go into adult services, young adults, and then become adults. And it's obvious to say, but at every life stage of that, the needs of people living with CF are quite different. The needs of a young baby with CF are quite different to an adult living with CF who would like to start a family. So the other area we're trying to look at is what can we do to try and look at where are the key differences to be made in the human life cycle. Now the really interesting news is that we're looking at some work at the moment that's partly happening at the Royal Brompton Hospital and partly happening at Great Ormond Street Hospital to see what can we do to really stop children, young babies with lung disease actually getting, with CF, getting lung disease in the first place. The literature suggests that those children have got a predicted life expectancy now well into their 50s, and that's before any new medications or treatments come on stream. And if the treatment of those children can be got right, those children could realistically be, the first generation of CF pensioners. In fact, there might need to be a whole new area of medicine developed with the care of CF elderly, and that's our aspiration and our vision to get those doctors trained up. So there's one area of trying to look at young children. What are the interventions that can be done there? We also know that another key area to get absolutely right is the so-called transition time, when children move from paediatric services into adult services. Now, 10 years ago, this wasn't really a big issue because actually people saw CF as a childhood condition. Now, there are more people living with CF as adults in the UK than there are living as children. So getting those adult services right and getting the transition from childhood services to adult services right is really, really important. It's not an area the UK does fantastically on at the moment, so the data suggests to us. And so we're going to be doing some research to look into what can we do to make this an excellent part of how CF works in the UK. And the final area we're looking into the moment to do some work around is about transplant. I know we find lung disease and lung failure a difficult subject to talk about in CF. But we at the Trust don't think it's acceptable that too many people on the lung transplant list at the moment with CF die before lungs become available. We don't believe it has to be like that. It's not like that in other countries. It's a fixable problem, it's a doable problem, and we're going to set about seeing what can be done to deal with that problem. But the second area is not just about the research for the future, but it's about making sure we've got excellent clinical care for today. And I'm going to say a bit more about that in just a moment. So what the Trust has developed over the last 10 years or so is some quite effective ways of trying to make sure that we do have excellent clinical care in this country. Now, I should caution this because this has not been the CF Trust alone doing this. Lots of other actors have been working on this as well to try and make sure that there are some really excellent doctors working in CF. But let me tell you what some of the things we're doing at the moment to try and support that. Some of you may be aware that we run a patient registry. Thank you for consenting for your relatives' data to be held by us on that. We hold a registry of about 99% of all UK patients and their CF data. And what we can do with that is we can start to monitor and track quite carefully what's happening in different care centres around the country and help doctors to be able to reflect on their practice and learn what delivers excellent CF care. And not only can we do that comparison inside the UK, we can compare that data sets with data sets in the US as well and find out, well, what are the international learnings to be done to enable us to have excellent care in the UK as compared to other countries as well. Now, our view is that we can do a lot more with that data. We can drill down into it, we can do lots more things with it to try and find out what are some new patterns inside CF care, which, having learnt it in one set of patients in one hospital, we can transfer that learning quickly to another hospital so it can be implemented there. Second thing we've been doing over the last few years, and we're virtually there on this, is developing a methodology by which CF care is paid for by the Department for Health. If we just had a quick discussion around just now this evening, we'd all have stories, I'm sure, of where CF care at the moment is inequitable around the UK. Different hospitals have access to different treatments and different antibiotics, etc., often arranged by local deals with the pharmaceutical industry. What we're wanting to move towards is a situation where everyone has access to the care they need. And that's a system called payment by results, but it's a way, basically, which we're working with the government and Department for Health to make sure that everyone who gets the care they need properly funded. We've got some concerns about that as well in this, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. And the third thing we're doing, as you may know, is running a peer review programme. This is a bit like Ofsted inspections of CF centres. Actually, we have absolutely no right to do these whatsoever. We're a private organisation and we have no statutory right to do this. And we do it with the consent and agreement of hospitals, and it is literally peer review. We take a clinician from one hospital and they help review a service at another hospital. and that helps to drive up standards. But what we've been doing now is we're starting to develop this year something called a quality improvement programme, and this, we're going to link all these things together. So we know now which patients have got which types of CF and how they're being treated in different hospitals. We can measure that and we can monitor it. We know how the government are going to pay for it. We know all the standards of care people should be getting through the standards of care which we oblige the government to use. And then finally, for our peer review process, we can check to see if that's being used. And what we're doing here, as you can probably see, trying to drive an upward circle of constantly improving CF care in the UK. It's driving forward the centres which are doing really, really well. Is to make those not just UK leaders, but world leaders. The services doing less well is to give them advice and help and encouragement and cajoling them at times as well, to improve the quality of the care they're offering as well. And the second area in this, which we're really keen to work on at the moment, is making sure we get accessibility right, both in schools and in the workplace. We know that some schools are absolutely brilliant with children with CF, but sadly we hear too many stories also of places where schools are just not well geared up to encourage and affirm and support children living with CF. So what we're keen to do is to make sure that teachers and other healthcare and other educational professionals know what they can best do to support the children in their community to have the best experience of schooling they can. And we're also keen to make sure that we do that with adults living with CF, they have best access to the workplace as well. You and I know the reality of this, that people with CF are often very driven, very tenacious people who deal with an enormous amount in their lives and still manage to go to work as well and everything else. But sadly, too often employers can actually more see the negative side of CF and make it hard. It makes it harder for people with CF to get employment. We know there's a link between being employed and the state of our health. We know it's good news for your health to be in work, etc., etc. So it's really in our interest to try and encourage as many people with CF as we can do to be able to be in the workplace, whilst at the same time ensuring those who can't work, who are just not well enough to work, have the proper access to benefits and social support which they need in order to be able to live. And then this is a slide which is based upon some research that was done in Birmingham and tries to tell the story of why getting this level of care right is really, really important. This top group here, this is supposed to represent when life expectancy inside CF was a lot shorter than it was today. This is the sort of the medium years, and this is probably where we are today. And as you'll see from the colour coding, what the research is showing is that actually, although people are living much longer now, which is obviously fantastic, what's also expanding is a length of time when people are having quite significant problems with their health. So the NHS used to have to look after fewer people for a shorter period of time. It's now looking after a much larger number of people for a much longer time. So as we increase life expectancy, the need for us to make sure that proper resources are applied in the NHS to look after people with CF is also increasing quite dramatically. And that's why I was just talking to one of you before we met tonight about the levels of funding inside CF care at the moment. And I'm going to talk about some practical ways in which we can work on that together to make sure we get that right going forward into the future. So there's two areas. Increasing life expectancy, I'll go on to the drug stuff in just a moment, and improving the quality of life, not least in this area here, when illness starts to catch up with us. So what we've found over the last year, sadly, is although the government have been very clear that £20 billion worth of cuts in the NHS will be delivered without any impact to frontline services, I guess our suspicion is that's probably not quite as accurate as it might sound. In fact, we've done research around the UK, and we've heard that place after place after place, cuts are happening. It's not on closing a hospital, but it's, well, that dietitian who's gone on maternity leave isn't being replaced. The physio who did 5 days a week in CF is now doing 4 days and another day on general respiratory ward. It's the consultant who goes on leave and isn't replaced for a while. And when you add up all those bits up, it adds up to quite a lot. So just a little anecdotal story for you. We started this campaign about 12 months ago where we encouraged people to write to their MPs, but their MPs then to speak to the Secretary of State to say that they were unhappy about cuts happening within the health service. And we then wrote a letter in, and we had a reply back, and it came from someone who gave their job title as Department of Health Customer Care Support Officer or something. And to be honest, we felt pretty frustrated with that because this is a really important issue and we didn't think it was getting the traction it deserved. However, then last autumn, I went to the Conservative Party conference and deliberately bumped into Andrew Lansley in the bar of the conference hotel, and he was there sort of unbriefed and without his advisors, etc. And he saw me and said, "Matthew Reed, why do people keep on coming up to me and talking about cuts in CF services all around the UK?" And the story it told me is that actually, rather than us thinking this was something which was not hitting the mark, actually the Secretary of State was being lobbied quite heavily by MPs about cuts in services, and he'd sent a signal back through the system, because we heard it coming back out the other end, saying that the Department of Health were going to watch quite carefully about cuts in CF services. Now, I'm not pretending that having a letter-writing campaign and me bumping into the Secretary of State at a conference solves the problem. It doesn't. We've got to keep on the case about it. But my point is this. You should feel that writing to your MP and actually making your case known about the need for us having excellence in CF care is a really good thing to do. It does actually make a difference. It might not feel like it's a very, there are many votes in CF, but actually our community is a tenacious community and we need to get those letters written and to hold politicians' feet to the flame over it. It does make a difference. So becoming stronger, this is the area where we need to make sure that we don't just hold services still as they are now, but we continue to expand them and make them even better for the future. So we know, actually all around the UK, many of the leading physicians inside CF today are only working in CF because they happen to accidentally come across a training grant from the CF Trust many years ago that enabled them to train to be a consultant inside CF. We often say that people arrive by accident and stay by design. People love working in CF, but they need to be encouraged to come into working in CF in the first place through training grants. So part of what we need to do is make sure that a whole generation of consultants are about to retire, make sure we've got the next generation of consultants is being properly trained. We need to make sure that we've got not just the best physicians, but also physios and dietitians and other members of the multidisciplinary team as well. We've got a real challenge also to make sure that new drug developments that happen happen in a way which are reduce the therapeutic burden. You know, people like us, we spend an awful lot of time investing money into finding new therapies and new treatments inside CF. Yet actually, the statistics show that about 50% at the moment of drugs which are prescribed in cystic fibrosis are never actually used, and that figure is especially so amongst teenagers. Now, I've got a couple of those at home, so I know what they're like, and you know, most teenagers are not very compliant to much at all and don't appreciate being told what to do. In fact, they might do the opposite of what they're told to do. But certainly my own children are very compliant when it comes to brands. You know, I mean, my son is totally Apple brand compliant, you know, I mean, he'll do whatever he's told to do by Apple really. So I guess we wonder whether there are some tricks here to work out how we can actually make the business of taking medications and therapies easier for young people in particular, as well as working on the supply side to actually make the drugs easier to take in the first place. You know, you'll probably recognise the situation that just adding on another level of therapy might mean that one gets dropped somewhere. So part of what we're trying to work out is how we can reduce the burden by keeping the standards of, by making drugs easier to use and easier to take. And there's quite a lot of research going into that just now at the moment as well. For adults in particular, increasingly wanting to look at the non-medical impacts of CF, especially the social impacts. We know many people with CF now, fertility is a really big issue to grapple with. Starting a family, having children, trying to do that and hold down a job and everything else at the same time. These are really, really important issues because we don't walk around as medical beings, we walk around as social beings who interact with others and everything else. So our view is that more research needs to be done in the non-medical aspects of CF as well as part of that for the future. And the final bit I want to put in here is about clinical trials capacity. I'm going to go on to talk about the gene therapy trial in just a moment, but actually lots of other clinical trials are happening inside CF at the moment. A lot of them are happening not in the UK, sadly. The UK is not a very easy place to do clinical trials. It's not a very easy place to start doing clinical trials, and we don't have the systems in place to make it easy to get involved in clinical studies. And that's sad, actually, because the data shows that people involved in clinical studies, and whether they're on a placebo, i.e. they're on the dummy drug, if you like, or on the active drug, tend to actually do quite well being on a clinical study. And that's because if you bother to take the time off work and go and be on a clinical study and everything else, It's a bit like going to Weight Watchers. You start to watch quite carefully what you're doing, so I'm told. But on a clinical study, it's what people start to do is they start to take their therapies and their treatments quite seriously. They watch what they're eating. They make sure they do their nebulizers. They make sure they take their antibiotics. They make sure they're doing their physiotherapy, etc., etc., etc. And surprise, surprise, they start getting slightly better as a result of doing all that. So being involved in clinical studies is a good thing to do anyway, but it also leads to that next generation of drugs being developed and new understandings being found about the impact that drugs can have. So we're wanting to encourage, and at the moment we're working with our European colleagues just now as well to find ways in which we can make Europe and the UK an easier place for particularly American pharmaceutical companies to do clinical studies in the UK for the benefit of the UK CF community. And the final area, I don't think there's anything here which will totally surprise you. I know people rely upon us to be a trusted source of accurate information about CF. It's incumbent on us to keep on top of that and make sure that we can offer that accurate information. Because the way the health service works in the United Kingdom, or the four health services work, we've got to keep on top of politicians, not just at Westminster, but also in Scotland and in Northern Ireland and in Wales. Make sure young people are actually empowered to make the best choices they can about their own health. Make sure we can talk openly, constructively and helpfully about care for people living with CF before death and to look after families afterwards. And make sure we use the best use of technology. And most of all, we know this is really important to ensure that we keep the profile and the public messaging around CF high, partly as a way of helping us raise more money, but also telling the very positive stories that have to be told about the CF community in the UK. So those are the four areas which we're focusing on. And what I want to do now is go on to talk about some of the drugs which are in development just now as well. Some of you will be very, very familiar with this, and others perhaps are thinking what on earth's that up on the screen just now. I'm going to talk about drug development cycles, and I think it might be helpful if we just come to the same sort of level in the room first of all, of the different types of CF that are around. Is that okay? Who's seen this sort of graph before of the different classes of in CF and recognises it and thinks they understand it? Quite a few people. Okay, excellent. Well, I hope you'll bear with me while I go through, because it's quite important to understand this in order to understand some of the new drugs which are in development just at the moment. So this picture here is supposed to represent, it's a diagrammatic drawing obviously, but it's supposed to represent a normal cell. And this is the cell nucleus just here in pink, and these little dots here are supposed to represent the CFTR protein, the CF protein being produced and properly folded. And the top of the cell here, this is the cell membrane, and this dark bit here is supposed to represent the chloride channel, the gate, as it's sometimes referred to, through which has to be opened to make the CFTR function properly. And what we'll know, if this was a lung cell, on the top here we have those little hair type things, the cilia, which are the things which move mucus out of the lung. The mucus, for most of us, is moving out bacteria and pollutants and everything else, which is a good news thing to happen. We know that inside CF, because this channel doesn't work properly, the mucus becomes quite thick and sticky, and therefore the cilia can't move it along, and therefore it sits there, and therefore becomes infected and inflamed, and inflammation, etc., etc., etc. So a lot of effort inside CF research goes into trying to find a way to make a CF cell work like this. Now, you'll know that when the gene was first discovered back in 1989, it wasn't understood then that there were actually lots of different types of CF mutation. And I think now there are almost 2,000 different types have been identified. And what's more, people are coming to understand now the interaction between the CFTR gene, the CF gene if you like, and other genes in our bodies as well, which makes the situation even more complicated. But researchers and scientists group CF mutations together into different classes, because some mutations have a similar way of working. So the first mutation is this, the stop mutation. This is I don't know, the best parallel to this might be the factory conveyor belt, which is all ready to rock and roll to make the CFTR protein. And just when it starts up, someone pushes the emergency stop button and the CFTR stops being made. So the equipment's there in the nucleus of the cell, but it just doesn't make the CFTR protein. So the issue there, obviously, is to try and override the override button, if you like, is to try and make the production line start to produce CFTR protein. This mutation here, it's in the whole CF population, it's not very common. It's very common amongst people of Jewish people and people from a Jewish background. In fact, in Israel, about half the people living with CF live with this particular mutation. The second group of mutations, the class 2 mutations, this is a mutation which is most common anywhere in the world. It's the delta F508 mutation. About 80% of people living with CF have got this mutation. And this is where, as you can see from the diagram here, the CFTR is produced, we've got little dots there, but there's no arrow here. It's not tracking to the cell membrane. It's not actually moving to the factory gate. So go to my factory image again. The protein's been made, it's great, but it's not tracking, it's not getting to the factory gate. The third class here, which the G551D mutation is one of the examples of, the main example of, is where the protein is made, and you can see the arrow here, it gets to the factory gate, but the gate's locked when it gets there. It can't get out of the gate. So the effort in this mutation is to try and find a way to open the gate. Now, some of the mutations across here as well, which I'm going to focus on less, because I want to try and talk about some of the developments that are happening around these particular mutation types just here. About 4-5% of the CF community have got G551D mutations. But just so you can try and get your heads around this, the second most common place in the world to find that mutation is in the UK. In fact, there are 400 people in the UK with that mutation. And just to give you an idea of how that compares to other countries, in Belgium there's one. So this is a community which is rich in this particular mutation type. So what research has been trying to do is trying to find a way in which, as I said earlier, try and break into this disease life cycle. What I'm trying to do here is to show graphically what that means. So this is supposed to represent the way in which CFTR affects people living with CF. At this stage, we've got the basic mutation, which produces defective CFTR, which produces incorrect RNA transport, which produces the build-up of mucus in the lung, which causes infection, which causes inflammation, which causes lung damage. And a lot of the conventional therapies are trying to break this cycle here. They're trying to deal with the infection and the inflammation. Sorry, can you see from that angle? You just press it. Trying to deal with this infection and inflammation cycle just here. As you'll know, right from 1989, the ambition has been to try and head the thing off at the pass. It's been to try and actually start with dealing with the basic mutation right back here, and that's what gene therapy is. The range of drugs being developed by companies like Vertex at the moment, they are working at this point just here. They're trying to, it's just one step up from gene therapy, trying to find a way in which they can actually make the CFTR protein work properly. And again, I'll say a few more things about that in just a moment. But there's lots of research going on as well at the moment to try and impact on other parts of this cycle. And that's actually obviously quite important, because if people have already got inflammation in their lung or infection in their lung, then the issue is actually trying to get that under control, as well as trying to make sure that we're stopping further infection happening as well. Now, I said we'd try and share some good news with you tonight. This is a slide that represents all the different therapies which are actually in research inside CF at the moment. They're colour-coded to represent which part of that disease cycle they're trying to impact on. And without worrying about the detail, hopefully what you can pick up is it's a multicoloured chart. I.e., there's a lot of research going on in lots of different parts of the CF disease cycle just now. Where this is mapped is by phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 and filed. Again, I won't go on at length about the full cycles of how drugs are developed, but it's quite important we're going to talk about some of the other work in just a moment. Phase 1 trials, these are trials where the drug is just being tested for safety. Obviously, the idea is not to make patients less well at the end of taking a course of medication. And so phase 1 studies are there to test safety. Phase 2 trials then start to test in humans whether something actually works, whether it has no positive effect, efficacy. If it does, then drugs move into a phase 3 development cycle where they're tested in a lot more patients. This is typically hundreds of patients, this is typically thousands of patients. It's moving up to testing a lot more people. And then the final stage of that is then the production and the filing and the regulatory framework and everything else before something can actually come to market. And what you'll notice is there is a bit of a slope down here, and that's because, unsurprisingly, not all drugs tested in the pipeline actually get through a phase 2 trial. And so, sadly, all these drugs are invested in, but they won't all make it through to being therapies at the end of the road. But what I'm going to talk about is some drugs which are doing quite well in just that cycle at the moment. So, to the let me go back to this. You'll be aware that quite a lot of work has been going on in the UK to look at approaches towards gene therapy. That's how to deal with this problem just here. And in the US, there's been a lot of investment happening just here into trying to deal with CFTR drugs. Now, the really very good news, which you will know this, I'm sure, is that some of the work that's gone on to develop CFTR drugs has actually generated a significant breakthrough over the last 12 months. What the Americans have been doing is they're using a technique called high throughput screening. And this is a technique where it's a bit like trying to win the lottery by buying all the lottery tickets. You buy all the tickets, you must win eventually. High throughput screening tries to do that as a robotic way of testing compounds to see if they work. So they've tested, through Vertex Pharmaceuticals, this is work invested in by the American CF Foundation, they've tested 300,000 compounds to see which one will actually have a positive impact on the CFTR protein. And the good news is that they found number 770 of those drugs, Vertex 770, now called Kalydeco, has had, through clinical studies, a really dramatic breakthrough on patients who have got that gating mutation. You've probably seen the data already, but let me just tell you what it is. Patients on that study, they saw an increase in their lung function by 16 percentage points relative to where they started. So that's not 16 whole points, it's 16 relative to where they started, but that translated on average into over 10 percentage points in real terms. Now that actually is dramatic, and far more dramatic than the researchers were actually expecting to find. And because it's an oral medication, it's also had a positive impact on the digestive system as well and everything else. And in fact, patients on the trial saw quite a significant increase in their body mass index, which is also seen as a very positive thing. It's seen now, there's a very clear relationship between BMI and lung function, and so getting BMI up helps with lung function, etc. So these two things are related and important. Now, I haven't got the graph to show the trial data here, but some of the tests on this were done on children at the Royal Brompton Hospital and adults in Belfast. And it was a double-blinded trial, which means that neither the doctors nor the patients knew who was getting the placebo and who was getting the live ingredient. However, the study became unblinded within 2 weeks because the patients who had the active ingredient felt so much better. In fact, over a period of a year, they had a 50% drop in the number of hospital admissions. So the ultimate objective in all this research isn't just sort of playing around with the FEV1 and BMI and all that sort of stuff that's interesting to research scientists, but it's actually that people feel better and can actually cope with living their lives more easily. And the patients on that study found a huge increase in their general health. In fact, they were very, very naughty because they then stopped taking the rest of their medication, although they were told not to. But they felt they didn't need to bother with that all that any longer. And their sweat chloride levels, you know, the classic test for CF is a sweat chloride, it dropped to normal levels. And those patients felt great. Now that's the excellent news for patients who have got those gating mutations, which is only about 4% of the population. What is obviously less good news, therefore, is that they didn't find a drug which was going to deal with the 80% of people who have got the delta 508 mutation. So they carried on the robot testing away until they got to compound 809, Vertex 809, and which they thought would be a corrector, would actually make the protein track up to the cell. So the Vertex 770 opens the gate here, that's what it does. 809 has been trying to actually make the journey happen here to the factory gate in the first place. Now then they thought, well actually what we need to do is actually combine the two together. If we could combine together, we might have some quite dramatic impacts. So they've started doing some trials on that, and in fact testing different cohorts of patients with different types of that drug. And a phase 2 trial on that product is now halfway through. I'm going to show you the interim results for it in just a moment. The other area, obviously, that's been heavily researched in, and you'd have been very actively involved in this, many of you I know, is trying to find a way in which we could deal with the whole lot. Not just deal with one mutation at a time, but deal with the whole lot. That's what gene therapy is aiming to do, is to try and find a way, and we're trying to correct the gene, actually put a correct copy of the gene into the lung and make, therefore, the cell work properly in the first place. Okay, so that's just a little white tablet, isn't it, really? If you want to know what Kalydeco looks like, that's what it looks like just there. I'm not quite sure what it says V150 on it, but that's what Kalydeco tablets look like, if you want to know what they look like. I'll go on to talk about the cost of it in just a moment. So just to recap then, Vertex tested 300,000 compounds, had this dramatic breakthrough impact. It's been approved now for use in the US. It's got a massive price tag associated to it of hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient per annum. And that's going to cause us real problems in the UK, which I'll come back to in a minute. And at the moment, it's waiting for approval from the European Medicines Agency, and we're hoping that's going to come through in about July. Vertex 809, this is a so-called corrector. Midterm trials, very, very promising. In fact, let me show you some headlines that were in the press yesterday. So this is the hot off the news press. You may have picked it up on the internet. They released data yesterday from the Delta 508 trials, and these was the headline in the Boston Globe yesterday. Cystic fibrosis data triggers 55% jump in the share price of Vertex Pharmaceuticals. Reuters said yesterday a CF treatment is called game-changing. Now, what are they talking about? Well, I should put some caution about this because it's a very small sample. There's only 30 patients on this trial. It's a phase 2 trial. But 30% of those patients, which is only 11 people, so we've got to be cautious about this, but those patients showed an increase in lung function after 56 weeks, so it's consistent by more than 10%. So that's people who are homozygous for Delta 508, who've got 2 copies of the Delta 508 gene. Now that's why, and this is not languages coming out of the researchers, Reuters are not known for exaggerating. They're calling this game-changing, and Vertex stock shot up by 55% yesterday. In fact, the analysts think that Vertex could now be, its revenue could now be valued at $4 billion because of the results that came out yesterday. Now, I say we must really caution this because 10 patients, isn't 100 patients, and so the phase 2 trial is going to continue, but they're going to actually fast-track some of those patients into a phase 3 trial, which will hopefully move towards the regulatory endpoint far more quickly. So what we've seen here is that the Kalydeco product has proved scientifically that it's possible to impact on the CFTR protein by using small molecule drugs. And Vertex are now saying that they've actually begun to see action on the majority genotype, Delta 508. Now, in addition, the CF Foundation in the US is now working with Genzyme Pharmaceuticals, who have been bought over by Sanofi Aventis, a large French company. They've now got some more compounds they're going to test. Remember I said they tested 300,000 compounds here. They're testing 3 million compounds now to try and find the next generation of CFTR drugs. So they think they're pretty confident it's going to work. In fact, they're so confident, they're just investing $75 million at the moment in the next generation CFTR2 drugs that will come through afterwards. And that's why the research community are really talking about this as being a game-changing time. I know it's hard to put this in context, but never have results like this been seen in cystic fibrosis ever. There's been nothing like this on the market at all before. Now, there are issues about the cost here. Vertex have spent a lot of money on this drug so far, and their investors are expecting to see a return on it. They are expecting to be charging top dollar for it, by which they mean several £100,000 per patient per annum inside the UK. Now, as you and I know, that's not the sort of money the NHS throws around very, very easily. And I know some of you have been in contact with your MPs and your clinicians and everything else. There's a lot of traffic on our forum and on Facebook pages, etc. People have been concerned about this and wondering what NICE are going to say about it. Well, actually, this is not a drug that will go anywhere near NICE, because NICE doesn't deal with drugs of these types altogether. So this will come down to a conversation between Vertex Pharmaceuticals and the Department for Health. And what we're doing at the moment, behind the scenes, is we're gently edging each of those parties together to try and come to a conclusion on this. It's a bit of a phony war at the moment, because the drug isn't approved for use in Europe. But as soon as it is approved, not unreasonably, people in the UK will want to have access to that drug as soon as they can get it. So I'm just sort of giving a pre-warning, if you like, that there might need to be quite a bit of a battle about this. Certainly if I was around in July, I'd be at the front of the queue to be banging heads together saying, look, we don't go for all the trouble to develop new drugs if they're not prescribable on the NHS, etc. So those of you who wonder what can be done at the moment, well, what can be done at the moment is to make sure that if you're on the case with your MP anyway, make sure they understand how important it is inside CF that this drug is prescribed on the NHS in the UK. But when it comes through to later in the year and the drug's not prescribed, if it's not prescribed or paid for by the NHS, we will have to get ourselves mobilised pretty quickly to deal with that situation. This is just some of the other stuff, the financial analysts said. I won't bore you with that just now, but that was something saying about the Vertex situation last night. Okay, so remember, that's all trying to deal with the CFTR drugs. But the aspiration, ever since the gene was first discovered back in 1989, has been to try and find a way in which we could actually deal with the basic defect in the first place. So what I want to do now is update you on where the gene therapy work is. That's the research that's trying to deal with that basic defect and what the next steps are in this work just a moment. I should change that slide. So you'll probably be aware that some of you will have heard talks about gene therapy. A lot will be so very familiar with this. But just to recap, there are two main products in development inside gene therapy at the moment, called the Wave 1 and the Wave 2 product. The Wave 1 is they're both trying to put a correct copy of the CF gene in people's lungs, and what the team have done is uniquely anywhere in the world, they've managed to isolate the gene, correct it, and sort of put it in a package which can be put into people's lungs. The issue comes about how to go about doing that. And if the Gene Therapy Consortium were here this evening, they'd be reminding us that actually most of us, our lungs are really well rehearsed at kicking stuff out of the lung that shouldn't be there. In fact, our lung tissue replenishes itself every 28 days or so that most of us have really fantastic new cells coming forward in our lungs. Unfortunately, inside CF, that means brand new CF cells are coming forward every 28 days as well. So the issue is not just about a one-off treatment for gene therapy, it's about how to keep the treatment going so that we can, every month or every part of that cycle, make sure the cells are corrected. So the first way in which the team have been trying to deal with this is through a lipid delivery mechanism. It's like a fat globule which the DNA is put into, and it's inhaled through a nebulizer into the lung. The second product, which is further back in development at the moment, is called the Wave 2 product, and this is trying to use a virus to get the DNA into the lung. We know that viruses are very good at doing that, that's how they work anyway, but we also know that humans are pretty good at dealing with mechanisms to stop that happening a second time through developing immunity. So part of the problem here is to try and find a way in which repeat doses can be given of a viral vector without causing immunity after the first dose. And as you'll know, actually, I'll say pre-phase 2. It's actually phase 2 now. It's just starting in these few weeks in May, and the Wave 2 work we know is in a preclinical stage. So let me just give a little bit more information about what's happening on the Wave 1 work. You'll be aware this is cutting-edge technology. This is the only place it's happening anywhere in the world, and what the research has been able to do over the last decade is to do all the initial research around this work, identifying the DNA, get it packaged up, work out which lipid is best to use. In fact, I think they had to test their own lipid number 169 just now, which they found was the best one they could use for doing gene therapy with. They've worked out how to manufacture it, which has been quite tricky in its own right. And a single dose was given inside humans, the so-called run-in study or the phase 1 study. I think probably some people here tonight, their children have been on the Wave 1 study. What that was to do was to see, don't forget that was a safety study, but at the same time the team looked to measure to see what impact was being had in that study as well. And what they found after one dose was that some of the patients didn't really show much response at all. Some of the patients showed some response, and some of the patients showed a really dramatic response. In fact, the group who showed the most dramatic response, in fact it was only a few patients, I think it was only one patient, but showed such a dramatic response that they were still showing normal levels of gene expression after about 40 or 50 days. And again, I think that took the team really by surprise. They measured it by measuring the potential difference in nasal tissue, because that was easy to do, not very pleasant, but easy to do, and were staggered by the results they got. But disappointed that the third, who didn't show much response at all, hadn't shown much response. But the theory has been, well, perhaps you just need to build this up. Perhaps there is an effect, a cumulative effect over a number of doses that would actually start to make gene expression work for all patients. So in order to do that, they need to do a multi-dose test. They need to test people repeatedly over and over. And that's the trial they're just about to start now. But before they could do that, they had to do the safety studies around that. And the way in which the drug development cycles work in the UK is that you have to test drugs in mice, first of all. Now, you and I might spot the obvious problem here, that mice lungs are about the size of a table tennis ball, whereas an adult CF lung spread out has got the surface area of a tennis court. And so trying to compare the two is actually slightly tricky. So they also had available to them what's referred to as a sheep facility, which I think is otherwise known as a farm. On it was some sheep, and sheep have lungs which are far more similar to a human lung in size. So that's why these sheep were used. So both the mice and the sheep have been exposed to multiple doses of gene therapy to see what effect it had. Now don't forget, this was safety testing again, but obviously the team don't want to start putting compounds into people which are actually going to harm them. But whilst the safety work was being done, they also tested to see what efficacy was happening in their lungs. Now these were not CF sheep. You can get CF pigs actually, they're bred in America, so especially for CF research. But these were not CF sheep. They were just ordinary sheep, but they cleverly put a marker in so they could tell whether the gene expression that was happening as a result of the gene therapy or was just part of the natural background CFTR expression which the sheep were having anyway. And what they found was this. After the first dose, a third of the sheep didn't show much change, a third of the sheep showed some change, and a third of the sheep showed quite a dramatic change. After multiple doses, all the sheep showed a dramatic change. So from the team's point of view, they feel as if it's been proof of concept, if you like, that actually the gene therapy can build a cumulative effect. They've been really, really excited about that. Again, I think it's the first time that's been seen anywhere in the world, and gave them the confidence to therefore say, well, let's put together an hour test in humans, which is the phase 2 trial, which is about to start us now, to see if that's replicated in humans. Not just in terms of gene expression, but if you like, the golden nugget in all this, trying to see, does it make people actually feel better? Are people going to hospital less? Are they having less exasperations? Are they having less antibiotics? Are they just actually feeling generally better? So the phase 2 trial that's about to start now is to test just that, is to see if after the result of taking 12 doses of gene therapy, people are actually feeling better. Now, the results to date, well, I've told you about this, the result that will come from a sheep. It will be hugely interesting, I know, to be able to see the data on this over the next 12, 18 months as the trial's going along. The way in which this trial works, though, it's a double-blinded trial again, so the doctors administering the drug don't know who's got the placebo and who's got the active ingredient, but neither do the patients. And part of the way this works is the data is not revealed to the researchers while the trial's ongoing either. So somewhat frustratingly for us all, there won't be any data about this until the trial has finished. And as you'll probably know from literature, etc., the end date for this trial is at the moment planned to be about 2014. That's when we're expecting to get data coming out of this study. As you'll know, just to say a word about the money problem is now resolved, but I know many of you have been very concerned about this, and secondly have done a huge amount to try and raise the money to make this happen. So let me just give you an update on it briefly. the issue was last year trying to find a way in which the whole cost of this trial could be funded. What the researchers wanted to make sure didn't happen, and we agreed with them, was that we didn't start doing half a clinical trial. Because half a clinical trial leads to data which isn't much of use to anybody. So if you're going to, people are going to go to the trouble of taking a risk on taking the compound in the first place, that their involvement there should be honoured by making sure the whole trial could get properly funded, and that's why we needed to get the full £6 million together at the start. As you'll know, the good news is that partly through the resource, the trust was able to, additional trust money, the trust was able to raise last year, and thank you for your part in helping with that. But as importantly, the money which the government made available through the EME programme means now the funding is now in place for that study to work right through to 2014, which is obviously fantastic. So the EME, I can't go through the full text on this, but if you want to, if you're interested in looking at some of the details around this, you can Google NIHR, EME, gene therapy and have a look, and you'll find there all the information about this trial, how the trial is going to work, when people are going to be dosed, how much they're going to get, etc., etc. It's all there in the public domain, and if you're interested in those types of things, it's there to have a good look at. I should say though this, that the EME had never made a grant anywhere near this size before. In fact, I think we all thought it was a bit of a long shot making the application in the first place. So the fact that this work has been funded after extensive peer review is actually very, very encouraging for the future of this technology. So there we have two really exciting different types of things in the pipeline at the moment. The work that's going around small molecules and the work that's going around gene therapy. Now, I don't want to start taking a view on how this is all going to play out into the future, but quite a lot of the research community who I speak to think that the future may well lie in combinations of these types of therapies. So, and that's why I was keen we understood about the different classes of mutation. The future may well lie in people having combinations of some small molecules, some gene therapy, some use of new antibiotics, etc. A more sort of personalised therapeutic regime has been developed in the future on an individual basis, and there's some quite exciting work around that just at the moment as well. Now, the next stage is going to be developed after the clinical trial, you know, as we've fairly well publicised, is to try and make sure there's a commercial partner who can take this right through to production. Phase 3 trials can be even more expensive than Phase 2 trials because they involve more people, multiple sites, multiple different countries, etc. And then, if you're making a new drug, you then have to make the thing, you have to train people to use it, you have to ship it, you have to pay for the regulators, you have to pay for the staff at the organisation all the time that's being done before any money comes back in at all, and all that costs quite a lot of money. So what we're doing is working with the Gene Therapy Consortium to try and make sure there is a commercial partner who can take this forward at the end of this trial. We're pretty optimistic, I have to say, because end of Phase 2 trials are typically when the pharmaceutical industry invests in drugs in the pipeline. So if the data is looking good at the end of the Phase 2 trial, we are expecting it to be an easier sell at that stage to get the pharmaceutical company involved. So just to give you a traffic light from where we are gene therapy just now at the moment, as far as the Wave 1 product is concerned, the money is now in place. That's on a green. Efficacy, well, we just don't know yet, and we won't know until 2014. All the pre-data is looking really, really promising and really encouraging, but just because we just don't know, I've put that on amber at the moment. The commercial route forward after the Phase 2 is not in place just yet. I mean, that is now a significant effort going on to try and secure that route going forward after that. It's not our concern, it's not in place just yet, but that's the next stage that needs to come along. Wave 2. This is the viral vector, remember. This is at a much earlier stage of development just now. Initial research has been done. It hasn't been tested in humans yet, but it has been quite extensively tested in the laboratory. And the really exciting news about the Wave 2 programme is that in the lab, this is showing efficacy 50 times as great as the Wave 1 product. Again, those of you who here who know you are carriers of the CF gene will know that actually you've only got one working copy of a good CF gene. Therefore, you actually only got 50% of gene expression going on. And most of you are probably feeling okay, and probably most of you don't often go to hospital to have checkups, etc., you probably function just fine. So again, if the researchers were here tonight, they'd be saying, look, you don't have to correct this to 100%. 50% is just fine, because actually people who've got 50% expression just now are doing just fine. Both these things in the pipeline just now have got huge potential going forward. Don't forget, those sheep were showing 100% expression, and we're only probably looking for 50% out of this program. Financing of this, it's going to be very expensive going forward, and at the moment there are ongoing conversations about how that work is going to be financed. But the Gene Therapy Consortium have recently secured a £1.5 million grant from the Medical Research Council to do the next section of that work, which is very encouraging as well. And I'm going to talk about some new research in just a moment, but let me just pause there on new drug development and see if anyone would like to ask any questions or observations.